G'day guys, welcome to the January 2021 Sydney.net user group coming here from the chapel here. It is a strange date to be saying, 2021. And tonight, let me scroll down and you will see that we have Matt Goldman talking tonight about multi-tenancy. And that talk is done by a person who is a real deep thinker in getting applications scaled across many sites. So you build an application and you need many companies to use it. There's many ways to skin that cat. You can have a big database, you can have a database for every customer, you can use schemas and lots of other things. And the tricky part often comes with mobile apps, and he talks about that as well. So that should be good. But before we do that, let's talk news. And the news, well, I have a little bit of Teams news. And the Teams news that first I'll talk about Power Apps, because we're doing more and more Power Apps. And one of the things that you want to be able to do is you want to be able to send notifications. So when you're doing these Power Apps, you have a browser and you have the mobile apps. And the mobile apps, people were just sending emails. So now you're able to turn it from sending emails to using mobile app notifications, such as what you're seeing there on the screen. So that's pretty good. How is that done? Well, if you jump into Power Apps, Power Automate, you will see that there is a new connector there, and you can fire that thing up, and it will open the right piece in the app. So the right piece in the app, you know, they kind of refer to it as a page here, but in Power Apps there's forms or views. And you know, when you're looking at a single record, that's a form. And when you're looking at a grid of data, we don't call that a list, which we should probably. They call that a view, okay? So I find that a bit confusing when you think about views in SQL Server and stuff. But, and there's been a whole lot of renaming of this. Remember Callum Simpson did a talk a couple of months ago on Power Apps and all the ways to build an enterprise app doing that. And since then, they renamed the known thing CDS, Common Data Service, and they were actually going to call that DataFlex, but that got changed. And so it's now called Dataverse. So we don't call it CDS anymore, it's Dataverse. And then for some reason, they renamed Entity. So Entity is now a table. So that's been changed. And one of the controls in there, you know when you have a choice of a few options, that was called an option set, and now it's just called a choice. So lots of renaming going on there. But anyway, let's move across to SQL Server. Now obviously the world, with coronavirus, it was an amazing time for companies to quickly do their digital transformations. They were talking about it for years, but all we needed was coronavirus, and companies did it really fast. I found this a bit fascinating when I had a look at this. Let me just have a look at this one, I think. So I didn't realize that the big growth was in Postgres SQL, and Azure SQL is number 2. So look at the scale of the growth here. This is phenomenal. Between January 2020 and now, not SQL Server, Azure SQL Database went from 28% to 71%. Like, that is a monster growth. And if you think about Microsoft with this product is charging usage, charging a monthly fee. What does that tell you? Buy shares in Microsoft, I guess. And then Mongo database is number 3. So there's lots of cool stuff there. Obviously, I expect in the future we will start seeing Cosmos because big apps are going into Cosmos and they're making lots of money. In fact, one of the guys in our company was working with a client, and they have a $2 million a year bill just for Cosmos. So that's pretty out there, isn't it? Anyway, what else do we have from the Microsoft world? Well, we have Microsoft Teams gets a new interface, so it looks a little different. And it's much easier to switch. I've been doing this a little bit recently, where you take a call on your phone and you quickly want to switch to your iPad or your desktop. It's much easier now to switch, so that's cool. And in addition, look at this. Microsoft is bringing CarPlay support to Microsoft Teams. So that is pretty good if you have an Apple system, and all the Audi people will be happy. Lots of people that use Apple. Now, of course, those use Android Auto, that they're getting that soon. I'm a Tesla man, so I don't get this. I'm very unhappy, but never mind. My daughter crashed my Tesla, so it doesn't even matter. So now let's move on to a little bit of hardware. Now, this is a leak, not confirmed. The Surface. We know what Surfaces look like. Most people say they look great. Here is an image. It's pretty little. It's a smaller image, and now all these Twitter links in here don't work anymore. But you'll see it's gone black. So let me just see if I can get a better image of that. Not easily, but oh, there we go. So you can see it's gone black. If that's true, that looks cool and different. I think what you might be even more interested in is that Microsoft are developing ARM chips now. So why do we need this? Like, why would Microsoft be doing ARM chips? Intel chips have been working very well, and the answer is that Apple have had such success, tremendous success with their M1 chips, and look at the results. In fact, even Windows on Parallels is faster on a M1 Mac than it is on a Surface Pro. That is out of control. So that is unbelievable, unbelievable. I'm very, very surprised by that. So what other news do we have? Well, I found this little bit of hardware news for you. Apple Watch is helping in the fight against COVID. So they're going to be able to help you, tell you if you have coronavirus. Now, part of the problem with getting COVID-19, or the biggest problem is, you are asymptomatic. You have it and you don't know about it. What they've discovered in a Stanford study is that your heart rate goes up for 9.5 days before you become symptomatic. So all we need to do is ask everyone to buy an Apple Watch. I actually have one. And if you've got an Apple Watch, then you will know. Anyway, that's the plan. So anyway, it's not confirmed, but it sounds bloody cool, if you ask me. Now, what other news do we have? Let's finish on a little bit of fun news. One of my favorite people in the world is Jack Ma from Alibaba. You've heard me talk about him a lot. He's becoming very powerful, and just like Australia, we like to chop tall poppies off. He is pretty much in charge of a big chunk of the money. I was in China for 3 months. You don't use a credit card. You only use Alipay or WeChat Pay. Nobody uses anything else. So for 3 months, I didn't use a credit card once. That's all I used. And this guy is in charge of it. We hadn't seen him for months and months and months. Anyway, he appeared after everyone was freaking out, and he doesn't even seem to raise a sweat in this little video. But anyway, it's only 50 seconds. You can have a look at it. But he is alive. Now, talking about big famous people, this is phenomenal. I was a bit surprised by this. Elon Musk is now the richest man in the world. All right, that wasn't him when he became the richest man in the world. That was before that. This is what he was when he became the richest. He wrote a tweet, "Well, back to work." So that was cute. But you know what? That is a phenomenal. Like, he has beaten Bill Gates, got software all over the world. He has beaten Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos makes a clip of pretty much so many people's products. Elon Musk has one product, and he has a product that became popular without advertising by just his brand. Now, obviously, I'm a fan of the Teslas, but like this is unbelievable. Now, I did a bit of Googling just to find out how is this really possible. And let me just have a look here. Look at this ramp up. This ramp up in production has been out of control. So you can see how quickly, how many cars he is making. So he's making a lot of cars. Now he's, obviously, I can't imagine this scaling forever because he's selling one product. Or, we know he has a few products and, has a few other companies as well. But just look at the deliveries of this just recently. Like the deliveries per quarter is insane, absolutely insane. I'm just so impressed that can happen. So anyway, let me tell you that I think a big chunk of that is he invested heavily in robotics in the early days, and that was obviously killing him and giving him sleepless nights, and he was sleeping at the factory and all that stuff. But obviously, when it comes together, you can get that scale in that top image, and that is phenomenal. Plus, he was smart. He set up a factory in Shanghai. China they have 50 electric car companies over there, and even though you can buy a decent electric car for $12,000, or you can pay $180,000 for a Tesla over there because they have a lot of duties. Now they're making it there. It should be cheaper, but that was the deal. People were still buying Tesla. Why? Because it's got a good brand. And I will finish on the last bit of news, which I found fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. We have Donald Trump, who causes a riot in the capital of Washington, D.C., and then he gets his account banned for 12 hours. He comes back, and then he does a couple of tweets, which were borderline on what he was saying. He basically just said, the 70 million people that voted for me will not be disrespected, and I will not attend Joe Biden's inauguration. And so they ban his account. And then on top of that, we then get all these companies ban him. So we get Facebook. Actually, Facebook went first, then Twitter, and then Google, Spotify, Snapchat, Instagram, Shopify, Reddit, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, and Pinterest. Anyway, lots of these, so heaps of them. And then what happens? We get Parler, and Parler is a Twitter-like site. Then Google take them out of the store, and then Apple take them out of the store. Like you can see this arms race going on, and then we have they said just go to the website, use the website, forget the apps, and then AWS, Amazon, kill it from a hosting point of view. And then a company comes together, which is called Gab, and they say, well, I've been there for 4 years, and they have been putting his tweets up there, and this is not running on any Microsoft Azure servers or AWS or anything. They've got their own servers, and then they've just been keeping his account, and then there's a whole lot of techie guys talking, well, Cloudflare is the answer to take them out. So this will be a fascinating piece of history when people are studying what the tech industry was doing and how they were using power of rich people like Jack Ma in China and Elon Musk, and now you got Mark Zuckerberg, and we got Jack from Twitter, and we got just all these personalities are making these big calls on their platforms, and it's fascinating. Like it was, we'll never see another time like this. Unbelievable. So anyway, with that positive news, I will introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is Matt Goldman. I am very much looking forward to tonight's session. It's got a cool title, Automagic Tenant Config for Mobile Apps, and it's just about multi-tenancy and the best way to approach this problem. So with that, I'll welcome you up. Thanks, Matt.
Hi, Adam. A lot of really fascinating news there, and we could certainly spend hours talking about a lot of that. Really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you very much for that introduction, Adam, and thank you very much for joining me this evening, everyone. I am just starting my presentation. So as Adam mentioned, my talk this evening is called Automagic Tenant Config for Mobile Apps. And today, this evening, I'll be talking you through what some of the challenges are and how we can solve some of those. So I'll kick it off. As we said, this is the title this evening: Automagic Tenant Config for Mobile Apps. Before we get stuck into it, I want to tell you about another magic mobile app, and that is SSW Rewards. SSW Rewards is an app that we've developed here at SSW. You can download it from the App Store. You can search for SSW, App Store or Google Play Store, or you can scan one of these QR codes that we've got on screen. And what you do with that app is you scan QR codes that you'll see. I'll give you one at the end of tonight's presentation for some rewards points, and you'll see them at SSW events and SSW conferences and talks. When all this horrible nastiness with COVID is over and we're allowed to see each other again, all of us SSW staff have our own QR code as well, and you can ask us to scan it and you get points. And you can see here in the screen we've got some cool prizes, and I'll show you here. I've got some examples. This is a SSW Smart Keep Cup, and we've also got a Xiaomi Mi Band. Now this isn't tied into the Apple Watch COVID test, but it can monitor your heart rate, and you could use this and do your own check as well. And there's some other cool things as well. So you can actually earn these rewards just by scanning QR codes and getting points. And there's some other really cool prizes that you can go into draws to win as well. Some bigger prizes. So download the app and keep watching, because at the end I'll give you a code that will let you earn some points. So a little bit about me. My name is Matt. Adam introduced me earlier. I work here at SSW doing web and mobile, .NET Core, Xamarin. I do some other web stuff as well. Those are my kind of key areas of interest. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Goldman. You can find my blog with all of one glorious post on it at goforgoldman.com. I'll be adding more, I promise. And you can find me on GitHub as well, Matt Goldman SSW. So that's me, and the agenda for this evening that I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned, the history of multi-tenancy, and I'll explain what we mean by multi-tenant, single tenant, and what the challenges are with web and how those are different for mobile. As you can see here in the agenda, config for web apps. I've got a nice green tick next to that because I don't believe that there's any such thing as a solved problem, but it's a very well understood and a very well accommodated problem. And then we'll talk about what the differences are with mobile and what those barriers are in mobile and what we mean when we talk about barriers versus enablers. And we'll look at how you can solve it the mundane way. And then we'll talk about invisibility and why in enterprise software development, invisibility is the most magical you can possibly be. And we'll look at how you can do that. So I want to talk about tenancy. And you can have, in an app, you've got different tenants. And a tenant is an isolated set of data. So if we use Office 365 and Exchange Online as an example, you have a tenant. So our corporate enterprise email here with SSW, we also have SharePoint and everything else as well. That's a tenant. And someone else's email is a tenant. And these tenants can be standalone. And the way that you do standalone tenants here is what's called a single tenant. And you have all of your tenants get their own standalone instance of the application. That's what's called single tenancy, because each single tenant is its own tenant. Then you can have multi-tenancy, and there's lots of ways of having multi-tenancy. And multi-tenancy means you have all the data for all your different tenants, all the instances for all your different tenants running from the same place. And one way you can do it is you can have your app, your one app, and you can have a config catalog, and that catalog, when someone logs in, tells your app what database to get their data from and what database to put their data in. And in this example here, we've got tenant A, tenant B, tenant C. They're each in their own database, and that one app accesses each of those databases individually, depending on who's logged in. And another option is shared multi-tenant. And in this case, you have multiple databases, but that's more for scaling rather than isolation. And in this model here, in this example, we've got tenants A, B, and C in one database. We've got tenants E, F, J, and K in another. Then we've got L in its own database and M in its own database. So you can provide different levels of isolation. They may correspond with different pricing tiers, different privacy tiers. But you've still got the one shared app over the top, and you've got a catalog that when people log in, the app knows where to get that user's data, knows which tenant they're in. So these diagrams here are actually from this Microsoft Azure SQL documentation, and I've got a link to it here on the screen. And this document explains in a bit more detail about what these are. But let's talk about them a bit more and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each. I want to be clear that some of these are applicable to more, and in some cases what I've done is I've gone with which one's easier or harder, but we'll talk about them a little bit. With a shared multi-tenancy environment, you get a shared management overhead. And that means that you can have one person looking after multiple environments, whereas if each one is on their own, if you've got multiple tenants in one environment, you're only looking after one environment. If you've got each tenant in its own environment, you're looking after multiple environments. So there's a bit of a shared management overhead benefit there. There's a benefit in terms of economy of scale. So you don't have to have one app instance or one database per tenant. There's a cost associated with those. You can have more in the one tenant, you get an economy of scale. This is where I've got here single set of configuration. This is one of those examples. So you can have a single set of configurations, certainly for the database per tenant, that middle column there. But it's a bit easier. It's a bit easier, you know, the more you share, the fewer configuration sets there are. Cost isolation. So again, cost isolation you can do, and there's ways of achieving it with all three of these. But it's just so much easier. It's so much easier if you've just got the one instance and the one resource set per tenant, per customer, per client. So that's one of the advantages of a single tenant deployment, or multiple single tenants. Administrative isolation. Now, you can have administrative isolation, again, in all of these. So certainly, with the database per tenant or even the shared multi-tenant, and a really good example of this is Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps actually went on a journey starting from the left side of the screen here, across to the right side of the screen. And they started off with one app and one database. And then they found that there's people signing up and creating Azure DevOps tenants. They don't necessarily use them, but it costs Microsoft money to host that and maintain it. They also had an issue when they changed the schema or they changed version. They now have to manage that across multiple databases. So they moved across to the middle where they had, you know, the one app and the one database. They ended up having just one database per tenant. And of course, those are administratively isolated. We at SSW don't have access to other tenants in Azure DevOps unless those permissions are granted to us, and vice versa. So you can do it, and the way that they do it in DevOps is that in every single table, every table in the database has a field called partition ID, and that corresponds to the tenant. And there's all kinds of permissions and mechanisms in place that stop people accessing stuff they don't have. So you can have administrative isolation, but it's easier with one tenant, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And also, you know, if you're doing the one tenant, if you offer it as standalone, you can do multiple different deployment models, but really you can offer that, as in you can do on-premise, you can do cloud, whereas if you just host it as SaaS, you know, it becomes more difficult. Again, not impossible. With a shared multi-tenancy, all your eggs in one basket. So is that a risk? Yeah, it's more of a risk. You got to consider it and whether it's an issue. May not be a problem. Now, this is the one that I was referring to earlier. With the shared multi-tenancy, you have a single administrative chain of delegation. What I mean by that is that if you take DevOps again as an example, yes, they're isolated and the permissions keep them separate, and that gives you your security and your privacy, but that chain and that security is issued, and those permissions are issued from a single chain that starts at the top with Microsoft. So the buck stops with Microsoft. Now, with DevOps, that doesn't really matter because it's all hosted on Microsoft anyway. They've got full control of it anyway. Doesn't really make any difference. But if you are hosting your own application and you have different clients and different tenants that have a need due to sovereignty purposes or privacy purposes to have absolute isolation from each other, and to not have that chain up to you where you can control it and for them to have it themselves, you don't get that with the shared multi-tenancy because you just physically can't. It goes up to a chain where ultimately one person controls it for all your tenants. Again, in practical terms, not a huge issue, but it may be a compliance issue. It's just something to think about. And of course, the downsides of the single tenant approach are you have greater management overhead because you're looking after all those tenants rather than just one. And of course, there's greater operational complexity to that. Okay, so when we talk about multi-tenancy, how long has this been an issue, and why is this such a well understood issue for web? Well, there's a screenshot here of Scott Hanselman's blog, and this is from a post back in 2006. And Scott Hanselman was actually talking about multi-tenancy at TechEd in 2006. So it's certainly a term that's been around for a while. But if you look at this Google trend here, what you'll see is you can see a bit of a spike there, people searching for it around 2006. It starts to pick up, but where it really takes off is around 2012, and you can see that on this chart here. And if you start to look back at the history, what you'll see is that around 2012 is when there was a big push of people moving to Office 365. Netflix exploded, and obviously AWS to compensate with that and accommodate that, and other people started to want to do it as well. So the term really picked up around 2012, and it's been going strong since then. So I mentioned that with web, it's a solved problem, and there's a quote that I have here from Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke is a famous science fiction author, for people that don't know. He's also the inventor, at least conceptually, of the communications satellite. And he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what he's saying is that, if something seems magical, there's really just some cool tech behind it. So what does that look like when we talk about multi-tenancy? Well, with web apps, it's a solved problem, and we'll look at why, or as close to solved as you get. And we'll look at why in a moment. With mobile apps, it's a real problem, and you need to provide that magic. If we look at WhatsApp here as an example, now WhatsApp is effectively a multi-tenant app. Everyone that uses WhatsApp, all of those tenants, all of those groups, all of those users, they're in the one instance. So when you open WhatsApp, you don't have to give it any configuration. You don't need to tell it where to connect to. You just log in, and then it connects to whatsapp.com. This is obviously an oversimplified explanation, but conceptually, it doesn't need to know what to do with you. It just goes to WhatsApp and it logs you in. If you compare that to Outlook on the mobile, someone installs the Outlook app on their mobile, and then they need to log in. Well, okay, the first thing it needs to know is, are you connected to this Exchange server here in this one enterprise? Another user opens it and they might want to connect to a different Exchange server in a different enterprise. Someone else opens it and they want to connect to Office 365. What do you do? Well, we're going to look at that this evening, and that's what we're going to investigate. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to an app that's going to work similar as Outlook. It's ssw.medman. For anyone that's seen any of my previous talks, I did one last year on authentication, and I created this demo Medman for that. I have a background in health as a sector, so I was interested in this. It's a very, very lightweight demo, but it's a medication management system. And our marketing team here at SSW have been working hard. This is fictional, by the way, just to clarify. It's not a real system. But either way, our marketing team have been working really hard, and they've secured us some contracts. And we are now going to implement this for some clients. And some of those clients are going to be running it in their own tenant. Some of them are going to be in a shared tenant. And we're going to have to accommodate all those different scenarios. First cab off the rank for us is going to be the Royal North Shore Hospital here in Sydney. And they're going to be running it with a hosting provider, and that hosting provider is called Goldman. And that's going to be the example we're going to work through a bit later on. We have also got a contract with Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Mayo Clinic, they're on board as well. They're going to be running it. Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, very famous children's hospital. We're lucky enough to have them as a customer. They're going to be running it. Walter Reed Medical Center. I'm going to have a word with marketing, because that is not supposed to be in there. That's confidential. But all these other ones, they're going to be running it, and they're going to be running different instances of it. We've got a mobile app, and that mobile app needs to know which instance to connect to. So the requirements are, customers will run their own instance of the application on their own URL. In this case, for Royal North Shore, it's going to be rnsmedman.goforgoldman.com. But it might be goforgoldman.com/rnsmedman. They might host it themselves, medman.rns.com. Those other clients that I mentioned that we're lucky enough to have on board, they might be running it. We might be hosting it for them. They might be running it on premises. They might be running it in their own cloud. You just don't know. the mobile app is going to have to know how to connect to those different instances. So all customers will download the same mobile app from the App Store. They just want their users to get it from the App Store. They don't want to have to deploy it with their MDM. They don't want to have their own custom build, more importantly. And no matter who it is, it needs to connect to their instance of the app at the back end. Now on the web, this is actually rather easy. On the web, you've got configuration, you've got app settings, you can configure these settings. This is Azure App Service here, and these app settings are the configuration in Azure App Service. There's a link there at the bottom as well that shows you where the documentation for this is. But various different bits of configuration for this instance can all be configured here. And you can get other things from Key Vault, from other areas as well. But it's all there, and your user just needs the URL for this app service. And that's it, that's all they need. Okay, so that's good. Another way of doing it is with DevOps variables. So this is some YAML code here. Again, this is from the Microsoft documentation. And there's a link there at the bottom of the screen where you can see where to get that from. But you can use these pipeline variables to introduce that config specific for your tenant or your deployment. And this works with app settings as well. You can use these variables to get those configuration values in there. There's also another really cool service here available from Azure called App Configuration. This is really good for multi-tenancy setups. This lets you actually centrally manage the configuration for all your different tenants across different deployment modalities, and that's really useful, that's really cool. So we can see here that for the web, it's kind of a solved problem, and I'm really only scratching the surface here. There's lots of different ways you can manage it, but the point is it's managed, and you manage it. So your sysadmins, your developers manage it, you configure it, you give your user the URL, boom, they're in. That's all you need to do. You compare that to a client app that's not a web app, a thick client. Anyone that's been working for 10, 20 years will recognize this horrible config screen here from Outlook. This is an old Outlook Windows XP screen. You see you've got to put in your name, you've got to put in an email address, you've got to put in some configuration and setup for your mail server, username, password. There's that dreaded more settings button down there at the bottom as well. You've got to click that, and then you've got to do more settings, and it's horrible. It's horrible. It's not very nice at all. So, but it is what it is. It works. It lets you put in settings. It lets you put configuration in. So let's have a look at how that might work. So this is a mobile phone here. So the first thing that I want to show you is Adobe Reader. Don't have it installed. I don't have it installed. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this email that I got from my sysadmin. And this email contains the information that I need to be able to use this new MedMan product at Royal North Shore Hospital. And while I'm waiting for it, we'll just go and have a look. So we can see here that I've got this MedMan application here running because I have a URL. Oh, there we go. Where's this email? Here we go. Welcome to MedMan. So we can see that my IT department has sent this email, and I'll just get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. In this email, we can see, welcome to MedMan. To access MedMan, go to this link, which I've already clicked on, and that's this one up here. So we can see that to use it on the web, we just go here and we can log in. But to use it on mobile, I've got to put in all these settings. So we'll have a look at what that looks like, and I will kick that build off. But while we're waiting, I'll just log in here. So we can see that I'm at rnsmedman.goforgoldman.com, and if I click login, we should have a nice Royal North Shore Hospital login that's specific for this instance. And I should be able to log in. I've got a nice secure password. Okay, cool. So we can log in, and I can click around, and I can look at this this app. So I'm logged in. I'm logged in with my Royal North Shore specific login. I didn't have to do anything to access this. All I had to do was go to this website from this URL that I was given and log in. So we can see that it's relatively easy on the web. So this problem is solved on the web. It's been configured for me. All I need to do is go to the URL and log in. Why can't I do this on mobile? Well, if I have a specific Royal North Shore MedMan app, I can, but you're not allowed to release those in the App Store. So Apple and Google don't let you release an app that's for one specific company in the App Store. You're not allowed to do that. What you have to do is deploy that via an enterprise portal. That, of course, is an option as well. You can do that. But if you want your app in the App Store, and if you're making your own enterprise app, that's okay, you can do that. But if you're making one that's going to be out there for the public and you're going to have multiple different clients, as we are, they really need to get it from the store. So if we have a look, I'm running this mobile app now. You should be able to see it on screen. I'm projecting my screen from this device, and you can see that already I've got this form. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Let's have a look at this and see if we can get this data here in this form. So I can't actually zoom that, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to move that off to the side there. Okay, so we can see first thing I've got is API URI. Okay, if I look at this email here from my sysadmin, I can see there's an API base URI. That must be it. So let's go ahead and type that in. rnsmedman.azurewebsites.net. This is very tedious on a small little screen like this and this fiddly little keyboard. But okay, it is what it is. So identity provider. I don't have a value here that says identity provider. What about IDP? Maybe that's it. So let's put that in. B2C tenant ID. Well, I don't have a tenant ID either. Now, if we look here, I've got app client ID, and that says client ID. I don't have domain, but I do have tenant name. It must be this domain. That must be my tenant ID. So let's go ahead and put that in. Okay, so this is really hard. So my users are not going to like this at all, but let's see if we can at least get it working. See, I've already had an autocorrect there that I didn't want. I don't think people are going to like this at all, but let's persevere and at least see if we can get it working. RNS Medman is the tenant name. The app client ID, oh, that's going to be fun to type. So AAA6C753-A354- oh, this is fun, 4C71- where am I up to? A98F-BF A41C BC BE0A. Well, I hope that's right, because if I've typed that wrong, that's not going to work, and I have to do the whole thing again, redo it. Now, if I had my work email set up on my phone, I could copy paste it. That would make things a lot easier. But anyway, sign-in policy ID. Well, we've got something that says sign up, sign-in policy ID. So maybe it's that. So let's put that in. So the first challenge that we're finding here is that you've got to make sure that the information that you're sending your users is the same and matches what they're going to see on their device. And that might change. The documentation might get out of date if any of these things change. This is just not a fun experience for our users here at all. But all right, I've managed to get everything typed in. I think that's all right. I hope I've typed it correctly. I'll hit save and we'll see what happened. Well, I didn't get any errors there. I don't know if I should expect any, but maybe now we can log in. So I've hit log in, and no, look at that. Look at that. 404 directory or file not found. Well, look, I don't know what I did wrong there, but I obviously did something wrong, and that's just not a good experience at all, and that's just not going to work. So let's not worry too much about that. That's just not a good solution at all. But let's look at how we did it. So we can see here that we have a config page, which you saw, it's a form. So I'm using Xamarin for this demo. We've got those values here that are bound to the back end, and then they get saved. So we're saving them here to secure storage. And we're also checking to see whether those settings are initialized, and if they're not, we show that form. Okay, well, it could work. It didn't work for me just then. I may have typed something wrong. There may be something else going wrong here. Who knows? It's just too hard, and it just didn't work. It just wasn't a nice experience. Even if it had worked, that wasn't great. So that's the Muggles way. That's not very magical at all. So this is what we saw. We had this complex form. You got to fill it in with fiddly little buttons, and you can get it wrong. These names didn't even match. That just wasn't nice. So let's ask a question though. If that had worked, great. What's wrong with this? Well, the problem is, even if it had worked, it wasn't a nice experience. And the problem is that, loose lips sink ships, and unfortunately, bad reviews sink good apps. And when you've got an app, doesn't matter how good it is, it can be the best app in the world, but you can get a bad review for it. I've got some reviews here that I found online. This first one is for Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go is one of the most successful mobile apps of all time. It's made God knows how much money. And we have here a 1-star review for it. A 1-star review that opens with the words, "Great game." This person actually liked this product, but thought it would be funny to leave a bad review. Now, it didn't really affect the success of Pokemon Go, and if you're lucky to be that big and not care about reviews like this, great. But it tore our family apart, and it's tongue in cheek. But those reviews affect the ratings, and the ratings affect your profitability of your app. I found another review here for a Steam game. This is for a virtual reality game on Steam, and they've given it a not recommended and a thumbs down. But it opens with, "One of the best games I've ever played, but I accidentally punched out my ceiling light while throwing a grenade. Give it 0 out of 10. I don't know if anyone's ever played VR. I love playing VR. You're very wary of the environment around you and breaking things. So this user may bear some of the responsibility for that, but it hasn't stopped them leaving this bad review. Or even worse, too much work. And just like that form we just saw, that's too much work. Your MedMan app may be great. It may be the best medication management application in the world. But if your users have to go through that process to sign up, that's just no fun for them, and they're not going to like it. So we saw earlier a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, and he said, any technology, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This guy, Gregory Benford, another science fiction author, he took it a step further, and he said, any technology distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. And what he means is not just, something that looks seen as magical just has cool tech. Cool tech has to seem magical, and that's what we need to aspire to. So let's see if we can improve our app a little bit and add some magic to it. Well, one thing we can do is, I thought I was running this app. Let's see. One thing we can do is we can make that easier for the user. We can give them a way of getting that configuration information into their phone without having to type it all. And one way you can do that is you've already got that config available here in your web app, because your web app works, right? You don't have to enter any of that configuration here. So your web app obviously has that configuration. So why not give that to the user somehow? There's lots of ways you can do that. One way that I've done it in an application that I've actually got in production with one of my clients before is like this. And what we do here is we just have, through the menu in the app, we have a little option that says show configuration, and then we get all that configuration that mobile app needs, and we put it into a QR code. And then when the user opens the app, and the app detects whether it's got its configuration initialized, instead of showing them a form to enter that data, gives them a QR code scanner. Now look, we have deployment errors here. Deployment failed. Well, you know what? I'm not going to spend time fixing that, because chances are with this phone and this camera and that amount of information density, it may not work anyway. And this is a really cool way of doing it, but what you need to be wary of when you do this kind of thing is that users have different devices. Some of them may not have a camera. Some of them may not want to grant your app camera permissions. Some of them may not have a good enough camera to resolve that level of detail. So nevertheless, it works. I've got it tried and tested in production in one of my client apps. And we can see here that this is an option. It is a really good option, but you've got to make sure you manage it right. And the problem that we have here is that QR code is just too dense. Now this phone theoretically should be able to read that and scan that QR code, but it's too dense. So you want to go about that a different way. And what you can do is that QR code is getting this config here, which is just in this JSON document at this URL. So instead of encoding all this information, and by the way, you don't want to put anything sensitive in here. So just as an aside, this example here, this contains all the information that's needed for this app to be able to authenticate, to log in. We're telling it what the identity provider is. In this case, it's Azure Active Directory B2C. and we've got the configuration information there for B2C. You can put other things, like you might have, if you use location services, you might have an API key with Google Maps. You might want to be able to tell your application at runtime to choose to use Google Maps or Azure Maps. You might have other things as well. You might have an organization-wide logging policy where you might say, yeah, we take verbose logs and we log everything, or you might have information or error only. This can be config that you can put here as well. But this is an unauthenticated document. This is a JSON document, so you want to be very careful and only put in things that are non-confidential there. But either way, this document is accessible. So instead of encoding all of that JSON in a QR code, why not just encode the URL? And you can do that too. And in fact, in my client that I spoke about, we started off doing the whole document and we switched to the URL just to improve that user experience and that scannability. And we found more users were able to scan that code when it just contained the URL than if you contained all of this document. So just looking back at this, assuming it had worked, that's a much more magical experience, right? That's great. But given that we're saying that you're just going to need a URL, why not just let the user put in the URL? Well, in fact, you can. And I have another demo. I have in this same demo, you can also have another version where you can put in the URL and you can get the config from there. And that works really well too. Now, in a real-world app, in these screenshots I'm showing you here, you've just got the one option with every version. In the real world, you would actually want both of those because for all the reasons where I said where the QR code might not work, you want to give people the option of putting in the URL. If people can scan a QR code, they may not want to go to the trouble of typing in the URL, just let them scan the code. So in a real-world app, you want both options. So give them the option to scan the QR code that contains all your config, give them the option to scan the URL. Now, either of those options is much more magical than that horrible form where we saw, but they're still not as magical as you want to be. And I said earlier that the best form of magic in an enterprise app is invisibility. And I've got another quote here, and this is from the TV show Futurama. And in this show, this quote comes from the character God, who's talking to one of the other characters, and he says, when you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all. And this is what we want to do. As software developers, as enterprise technology people, this is what we want to do. Our technology should be able to enhance and enable people doing their jobs, but it shouldn't be a barrier. And as soon as you put a laptop between, there's a laptop between me and you, and that's a barrier right now. As soon as you put technology as a barrier, it's taking people away from what their core job is. So it should be invisible, it should just be there. So how do we do that? How do we go from being a little bit magical to being invisible? Well, let's have a look. One way we can do it is we can look at this form. We can look at this form that Outlook have here. This is not very magical, right? So the user has to put in all this config, and then there's more settings. Oh, let's think about this. What can we get rid of here? What would you get rid of from this form? Well, you don't need that. You don't need their name. Nobody needs this server configuration or addresses. That's just tedious. The username should be the same as their email address. People are used to logging into things with their email address, so you shouldn't duplicate that. And we certainly don't want the dreaded more settings button. So all we want is the email address and the password, and that's what your user's going to use to log in. So how do you do that? How do we do that? How do we give users that invisible experience? Because when all they have to do is put in their username and their password, they don't have to do anything else. They were going to do that anyway, and it all just works. They're just going to say, is that all I have to do? It was invisible. There was nothing else there that they had to do. They don't even know that you've got magic going on behind the scenes. So how do we do that? Well, one way is like this. You can have your mobile app, and the user enters their email address. Then you can take that email address, and you can send it off to a config broker service. In this case, it would be an Azure function. And that can look up their SMTP domain from their email address in a config table sitting here on Cosmos. Adam mentioned the cost of that earlier, so you might want something else. But either way, you can have it there in a data source where you look up their config. And you then send their config back to the mobile device, and the app on their phone now knows who their identity provider is and where their backend is. And it can access those, and you can have the config for all these other different tenants as well. And it can be multi-tenant, it can be single tenant, and you end up with something like this. You got your mobile app, and that goes to the config broker, that looks up data, and it comes back, and this is already looking a bit messy. Now, this is a valid model. You can do this. This is a kind of borrowed idea from the identity broker concept in OAuth. You can look that up. I've got a link here to some Red Hat documentation. It's not specifically about what I'm showing you here, but it is about the identity broker, and it was the best documentation I could find about it. The identity broker works slightly different, but it's adapted from that concept. Identity broker, by the way, is if you have, for example, an authenticator app on your phone, instead of logging in directly to the service that you're authenticated to, it's brokered via that authenticator app. So when if you use Microsoft Authenticator and you approve a request and that logs you into something else, that's an identity broker. So we've taken that and adapted it, and we've got a config broker here. Perfectly valid configuration, and it works. But it's not ideal, and it's not ideal for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is this is a whole bunch more resources to maintain. You've got more management overhead here. The other problem is, if I'm the vendor of the Medman app, and I've got some of my customers using Medman, I can have their configuration in this config table here. But I've got other customers that are using it themselves and running it themselves. I'm dependent on getting that config data from them. I could even have a portal for them to update it, make it easier, but I'm still relying on them to update that data so that my users can seamlessly log in. Now, if they don't do it, we've got those backup options of putting in the URL, scanning QR code, or even have a fallback to the form if you want, but then we're not doing that invisible magic behind the scenes. With the URL or with the QR code, the user still had to do something that they weren't otherwise expecting to do, and when we do this, we risk falling back to that. You risk falling back to that anyway, so you need to account for it. We've got greater risk of that here. So instead of doing this, which effectively is reinventing the wheel, that's what we're doing here, we're reinventing the wheel. And sometimes, as you can see from Michelin here, there's very good reasons to reinvent the wheel, but this isn't one of them. And we looked at Outlook earlier, which we said isn't very magical, and what they've done is they've gone from that to that. So they've gone from this form, we've got to put in all this information, and they've gone from that to that, and all you put in is your email address. So why reinvent the wheel? Let's look at how they do it. But before we do that, eagle-eyed people among you may have noticed, magical as this is, that you have this option in Outlook now as well. I've seen that somewhere before. Interestingly enough, I have searched high and low in Office 365, Exchange Online, Outlook, Outlook.com. I can't find anywhere where you can actually get a QR code to scan to set up your mobile app. So I think Microsoft have seen that we're doing this with our client and think it's a really cool idea. So they've put this in as a placeholder. But, you know, I'm making assumptions there. But as I said, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's look at how Outlook do it. And let's talk about pick a tenant, any tenant, because this is going to be a magic trick. So Outlook, how do they do it? Well, Outlook have this, and they've been doing it for a long time. They've got this concept called auto discover. And what they do is you give them your email address and they use DNS. They take the SMTP domain from your email address and they look for a DNS record that's autodiscover.yoursmtpdomain.com. And if it finds it, it goes to that address and it looks for an XML document that contains the config. So if we do an NS lookup here, and I can do a search for autodiscover.ssw.com.au. Okay, so we can't find it for SSW, but let's look at another one. So if I were trying to set up Outlook on, for my SSW email address, this wouldn't necessarily work, and I'd have to put in those manual fields. So I'd have to have the fallback to another way of doing it. Let's try autodiscover. And by the way, sorry, it also looks for fallback addresses as well. So there's other places where you can have it. So it could be an A record, ssw.com.au/autodiscover. But this is the first one it looks for. So if we look for autodiscover.goforgoldman.com, there we go. We can see that I have a DNS record. It's an alias. It's a CNAME for autodiscover.goforgoldman.com, and we can see that if I were to put in my email address, matt@goforgoldman.com, into Outlook, Outlook will take that goforgoldman.com, it will tag the autodiscover on the beginning, and it will go and look for the config there. And because it's hosted on Exchange Online, it will find it. So we're going to steal this idea. We're going to use this because this works really well. Outlook is much better now where you just put in your email address than it used to be. So we're going to steal that. I can't use auto discover because Outlook's using that. So why don't we use discover medman? So if I do discover medman.ssw.com.au, we can see that there's a record. Now at the moment that record is pointing at Google's DNS server. So Google's DNS server would have to be hosting the config for us, or we'd have to fall back to one of those other manual methods. But Royal North Shore, who we're hosting it for, are not on SSW, they're using goforgoldman.com. So if we do discover medman.goforgoldman.com, we can see that, yes, there you go, there's a record, and that record points at, I'm just going to kick this off because these builds can take a while. There you go. I've lost the connection to my phone. I'm just going to fix that quickly, hopefully. In fact, I don't. If that doesn't work, I can just do it on the simulator here, so that's fine. So if we look at that discovermedman.goforgoldman.com, we should be able to do. We should be able to go to an address at that alias and find the config. So if I go discovermedman.goforgoldman.com/API/config, there we go. So we can see that we have a nice JSON document there with all the config that we need. It's just that we've just put in discovermedman.goforgoldman.com. So as the administrator of this instance and this tenant, it's up to me to configure that and make that run, not put it back on the vendor's config. I do still have to set it up, but all I have to do is create a DNS record, and that's it. So why don't we see how that works? So I am just going to kick this off. Now, oh no, that's the wrong device. Give me a moment while I just cancel this. I can't seem to stop it yet. Okay, never mind. I'll stop that. In fact, I can just run that on the emulator there because we don't need to scan the QR code, and that should work fine. So we can see here that I've got a config page. Now in my config page, I've just got one entry, which is asking for an email address. I don't have all those other forms. Why is asking for an email address better than asking for URL? It's still a field, and it's still a value that you have to put in. The reason it's better is because the user is expecting to... Now, I'm not having much luck today with this demo, am I? The user is expecting to be able to... the user is expecting to put in their email address anyway. So they're not necessarily expecting to put in a URL, but they are expecting to put in an email address. So putting in the email address is a better option. So we can see here we've got a form, we've got an email address, and that's all they have to put in. So why is this different? How does it work differently? Well, if we look at the view model here, we can see that the view model still has those properties. It still has those configuration values that we need. We still need those. We can't get away from that. But what we're doing here is we've got a validation message. So the first thing we do is they put in their email address, and when they hit button, which is bound to a command, it calls this say config method. There's a string that's bound to their email address, and we run that through this is valid email. And what the is valid email does is it basically just passes it through a regex. And the regex just checks it's a valid email and gives us a validation error if it's not, which we can see here. If it is valid, it goes to this next step here, and that's get domain from email. And again, we're just doing some string passing there. Very simple in this instance. What we're doing is looking for the @ symbol and getting everything after the @ symbol. Then once we've got the domain, we're looking for that discovermedman.domain /API/config, and we know that that's where to find it. I still can't run this, I'm afraid. You may have to trust me. I'm going to try and run that on there. So it looks for discover medman at the domain, and it goes and gets the config. It then tries to see if it then tries to get that config, and it validates it. If it doesn't work, it says didn't work, and you then want to fall back to your more manual options of manually entering the URL, manually completing the form, whatever those different options may be. But if it does work, it goes and gets those values from that JSON document and it saves them locally here. And all your user has had to do is enter their email address. I can't get this running right now. I'm not going to worry too much about that. The code is on GitHub, so you're welcome to play with this yourself. I'll make sure it's running and make sure we have a working build. But you can look at that on GitHub. You're going to have to trust me, I'm afraid, because I'm a magician. But what we're saying is that we're saying pick a tenant, any tenant, and when it works, you put in your email address. So all we're asking for is your email address, and from there we say, is this your tenant? And all we have to do is get your email address. And using your email address, we can go and get all your configuration from you. And I'm going to actually show you one more thing here. So the other thing that we do, just to make it that little bit more magical, as I said, the user is expecting to enter their email address. So getting them to enter that is not a big deal compared with entering the URL. But they've already entered it, right? So once they've entered it, they click login, you're going to have your B2C login come up. They don't want to have to enter it again. We're going to make it that little bit more magical. So the OAuth standard has a well-supported way of doing this, and that's with something called the login hint. Now, if you're using the Microsoft Identity Library, which I am here, Microsoft Authentication Library, which I am here, you can actually pass that email value through with a .with login hint property, and that will then automatically enter that email address for you in the username field, so the user doesn't have to type it twice, just for that extra bit of sparkle, that extra bit of magic. If you're not using MSAL or you're not using B2C, you can do this with additional parameters, which isn't coming up here at the moment. With extra query parameters, and then you can give it login hint, and you can pass it through that way. And if you're using a different library, doesn't matter what you're doing. There's a way of passing parameters with OAuth, and you give it login hint, and you pass as the parameter, and the email address as the value. And that means that pre-populates that in that field for them, and they don't have to enter it again. So what we've done is we've gone from this to them being able to just put in their password and log in. And that's just made all of that magic under the covers invisible. And we've said, is this your tenant? So I'm going to talk about some of the methods that we've talked about this evening. One way is, and the problem that we're talking about is when your user has a mobile device and they need to connect to a backend, and that backend could be anywhere. There's not just one backend, there's many. We have lots of different ways that your users can get that config in there because they need the config to connect to the right instance. First one we looked at is with a form, get them to input their data. Second one is with a QR code. You can scan that QR code and that will extract the data from it, or extract a URL and get that config document from the URL. If you're already exposing the config document at the URL, why not let them enter the URL? Why not find that URL using the trickery and magic of DNS and just extracting their SMTP domain from their email address and then going and finding that domain, going and finding that config document. There's one other popular way which I haven't covered in my demo, which I don't have covered in my demos here, and that's the way that streaming apps do it. If you have a streaming app, it's very likely that you're running it on a console, on a games console or on a small device. So you don't want to have to go through what we did of entering all that fiddly information and logging in on a little phone keyboard. So what they do now is when you launch the app on your console or on your phone, they say, go to this website, stan.com. This is a popular streaming service here in Australia, Stan. You can go to stan.com.au/activate and you log in and you enter that code, and that code then pings back to your console and logs you in on your console. Plex do this too. A slightly more enterprisey version of this is Azure CLI. When you do Azure CLI login, it does the same thing. It gives you a code. It says go to login.microsoft.com/device login, I think is the URL. It asks you for the code. You enter that code, and that then authenticates back your CLI session. So that's one of the other ways you can do it. Although I haven't covered that. But what we have covered is quite a lot, I think. We spoke about multi-tenancy, the history of it. We talked about single tenant versus multi-tenant, multiple single tenants. We looked at config for web apps. We looked at why it's not an issue for your end users for the web apps. We looked at mobile. We looked at why it's an issue for your end users for mobile. We looked at some barriers. I came across a few barriers this evening with my demo, which I will be spending the rest of the evening troubleshooting. We looked at enablers as well, and we looked at the magical. And unfortunately, I couldn't quite show you that magic this evening, But believe me, your users will appreciate it when you get that working. The magic of, a QR code is cool, but it's still something for them to do. It's pretty magical, more magical than a form, still something for them to do. When you just get them to put in their email, they don't know that there's any magic going on at all. They were going to do that anyway. And that's where you want to be. You want to be right in that magical spot where your users don't know you've done anything at all. Anyway, that has been a lot of fun. I obviously researched this and put some work into this. I really, really enjoyed putting those demos together. I will enjoy fixing them, and I really enjoyed spending this, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this evening as much as I have. Thank you. Thank you very much. I gave you guys a promise earlier, and that promise was to give you a QR code for this talk. And that QR code, sorry, one last thing, I forgot there's some resources here. Look, this slide's going to be online. This is a link to my GitHub for this repo, for the demos, some of the Microsoft documentation and the Red Hat documentation. This will be online. I did promise you a QR code that was going to give you some points, and there it is. So as you'll see, if you compare this to the other QR code that we saw earlier, this is a much less information-dense QR code. This is a much easier to scan QR code. So scan this, get the points. You can accumulate enough points, you can get some of these cool prizes here. You can get a Xiaomi Mi Band, which you can use to preemptively look out for COVID. You can get a SSW Smart Keep Cup. By the way, I don't know if I didn't show it. Yeah, well, you can tap the top of these cups. I don't know if the camera can pick it up there, and it actually shows you the temperature of the contents. So that's pretty magical as well. Well, we'd also love to know what you guys thought of this. So if you scan this QR code, it will take you to our URL where there's a survey. You can give some feedback on this evening's presentation. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys. I wonder if we have any questions coming in. Is anyone... do we have any questions from the live stream? Do we know?
On Teams, if you switch to Teams.
Yep. So we have Will, who I think is looking out for questions for us. Why don't I see if I can give him a call? Through the magic of Teams, Microsoft Teams. Oh, I seem to be calling everyone and not just Will. Let's see if anyone answers. Hello. William.
Hey.
How are you, Will?
I'm good. So that's not live.
This is live, yeah. You are currently on the live stream.
Oh, hello, everybody.
I don't suppose you could put your camera on, could you? Ah, hey, it's William. Hey, William.
Full screen.
Hey, everybody.
So, William, did you get the chance to check out my talk?
Oh, sure. I've been watching all night. I think I was maybe a minute behind the live stream for some reason.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Technology is pretty magical, but it's not that magical.
Yeah, that's all right. All good.
I was wondering if you had any questions, or if you have know of any questions that have come in from the live stream or anything like that.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, Matty. So at the start of your talk, you mentioned a few of the configuration options, and I was just sort of wondering, what was your favorite one? Because you can start with putting all the config into a SQL database, or we could use some of the other services like LaunchDarkly or even AppConfig service. Have you tried any of those in Anger for a real project?
No, I must admit I haven't. As the furthest I've got in terms of personally experimenting with that stuff is the DevOps variables. I like to use a combination of all of those things. So you do use the app settings, and there's some that we put in manually, and we specifically put them in manually because they're triggers for things that we only want to occur under special circumstances. The rest we get in from that DevOps pipeline, which they come from the ARM templates as well, and some of the config we get from Key Vault or from other sources as well. Now, Will, I know that you are a bit of an expert on these areas, so I'd be really keen to hear what other toys you've played with in this space.
A long time ago, I've played with LaunchDarkly, but recently I've been using AppConfig service, and it's sort of fairly cheap, almost free, I think. But you have the ability there to tag your config settings for different clients using a label, even for different regions. You've got a lot of flexibility in there. And as far as sort of DevOps experience goes, you can actually import and export your settings in bulk. And along with the settings, you also get feature flagging, so you can have your config and feature flagging for different tenants. I found that so far to be a fairly nice sort of superpower to build into the applications.
That's very cool. Yeah, very cool. And you're using those in live projects?
Yes, we do have app config service in live project, yeah.
Yeah. And have you had to get that config to any thick clients, like desktop clients or mobile apps?
Good question. The answer is currently no. No, I haven't done a thick client like that for some time, but I'm sure we can make it work.
Yeah.
There's always a way.
Well, you've seen some ways you can do that now, and of course I'm happy to help.
So I was wondering as well, Manny, with those sort of config endpoints that you are exposing out of your application, and that if it's a multi-tenanted app, have you had anyone sort of hammer those endpoints and try and put a bit of artificial load on your application? And then what would you do to guard against that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I haven't had that personally. Before I get onto that, one thing I want to say is, aside from that kind of denial of service aspect that you're talking about, there is of course one of security. So everything that I was exposing in my configuration document that you saw there is all things that are not sensitive. And you don't want to. And in fact, the B2C login flow I'm using as well, you wouldn't do that. You would use an authorization code flow so that the information that you're exposing is even lower risk. So you only want to expose things that you don't mind being out there, because for obvious reasons you can't protect that in terms of authentication, because people need to get that in order to be able to authenticate. So what you do in that case is you have the bare minimum, just what people need to be able to log in. If you have other values that are secure, you then go and retrieve those from the back end over an authenticated channel. And I actually have that in a real world deployment as well, where we do exactly that, where we have the bare minimum needed to configure your app to talk to the back end. Then you log in, and there are other things like, the example I used earlier was maps. So the mapping service, the client device needs a key, and that key is not exposed in that original document. That key is retrieved the first time the device needs it, and then it stores it securely locally. So you have to separate out what config you give away and what config people need to be authenticated for. In answer to your question, how do you guard against that? What you would do, or what I would do in that case, is I would not actually have that config endpoint be exposed in my API like that. I would have it sitting statically somewhere else, possibly even on a CDN, and then you have your device, when it goes to retrieve its config, it goes and gets it from the CDN instead.
Yeah, I like that idea. Cool. Yeah, I could even sometimes, depending on the situation, have a separate sort of config service on its own, and make that highly available in other ways. But
the downside of that,
that's actually really good. You're sort of offloading a lot of responsibility from your infrastructure.
Yeah, there is a downside to that, and the downside is that, as I mentioned early on, your web app already has all that config, so all you're doing is exposing it, right? So that is the downside. But your web app can just not have that config endpoint, and you can have another service that exposes that data. You can still get it from the same place. You can't necessarily make it static if you do that, but there's ways you can do it so that when it updates the static version, and that goes off to your CDN.
That's cool. So I've got one more question. Now you're talking a fair bit about Auth today, and B2C. I've heard you throw B2C around, but what about your other choices? Are you much of a favourite for Auth 0 or Identity Server? And Azure AD, not B2C, but Azure AD. What's your sort of pick of the bunch these days?
Well, I will tell you the same thing that I would always say, and that depends.
Trademark.
Yeah, I actually really like all of those services that you mentioned. They've got different pros and cons, and they've got different suitability to different scenarios. So B2C I'm using here because when you're just doing the basics out of the box, it's very quick and easy to set up, and there's a really good client library for it as well, which is the Microsoft Identity Client, which is that MSAL library. So all of that stuff works really simply. If you need to do anything a bit more complex, you can, but it's difficult with B2C. So The other thing with B2C that's good is that you get 50,000 active users a month for free. So if you're deploying something at scale that you really just need authentication for, you just can't go wrong. In the real world, with this app that I've used as a demo, it's an enterprise app. B2C sits as a layer on top of Azure AD, and you can actually just strip it out. And in the real world, I would just connect this straight to Azure AD. Your users are already in there. They're logging in with their enterprise email address, which is tied to their Azure identity. And that's what I would do, is I would just use Azure AD. I also like Auth0. Auth0 is really simple to set up. If you want to do the more complex stuff, it's easier to do it in than it is in B2C. And it's also, it straddles a bit that enterprise and consumer application space. And the other one you mentioned is Identity Server. Identity Server is fantastic. It's really good. It takes all the heavy lifting out for you, but it serves a purpose, and that is if you want to have shared identity across multiple applications that you're developing. It lets you abstract out that identity and put it in the one and share it across all of them. So which do I like? What's my pick of the bunch? All of them. And the answer is it depends, and it depends on your use case. They're all really, really great products. The one you didn't mention is Okta.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Okta have kind of cornered the market for, well, they've carved out a good reputation in the enterprise application space, and they've got all their connectors, which you can develop yourself, but they give you them, and they've got that reputation, and they connect to nearly any enterprise app, and if there's one that you want them to connect to that they don't, they'll do it. Again, you can do that yourself, but in the enterprise space, if you want someone that's done it for you and someone that will give you really good support that comes at a cost, Okta's a good one for that as well.
Oh, very cool. I think, Adam, you're probably burning for a couple of questions by now.
Probably, but you're doing a good job, Will. Don't worry about it. I have a question. If you're talking about a client and you're frightened of being sued, so let's just say you're building an app and you want to sell it to banks or financial institutions. Let's just say you build an app and you want to sell it to 4 big banks, and if any of that data could possibly cross-pollinate, how would you do your tenancy? Would you still put it in one database, or multiple schemas, or multiple databases?
So here's the thing, right? From a technology perspective, as developers, we know that you can have it all in one database, and it's separated. You can have it in different schemas, you can have it in different partitions, you can even have it in the same table with a partition ID column. And as long as you've got your wiring set up correctly, that's going to give you as good separation and as good privacy and isolation as having them in different databases or different instances is, from a technology perspective. But when we talk about selling something and being worried about being sued, but more from a marketing perspective, it's not always that matters. And sometimes what matters is being able to say that, this is completely, A is completely separated from B. It's air-gapped. There's absolutely no possibility of cross-pollination whatsoever. When you say, we have set this up in such a way that these things can't cross-pollinate, that's fine. But being able to say, it doesn't matter how we set them up, they're just not connected. There's no way that A can get to B. It just can't happen. It gives clients that little bit more confidence, and it gives you that little bit of that extra little bit of marketing spin, where you can say this is something that's completely separate. When I talk earlier about the delegated chain of administration, if you are hosting it for your client, it still makes no difference anyway. I mean, ultimately, if it all comes up to your one identity, you as an admin of those services, it's still all up the same chain, and you still have access to you have access to A and B, even though A and B can't physically access each other. There's that administrative chain of delegation that goes all the way up to the top to a single point. So in that case, and again, when you're talking about a bank as an example, you would probably want them completely hosted separately. And the way that you would do that is they might be on separate hosting tenants. So rather than, even though they're not hosted together as in the same instance of your application, but separated through other logical mechanisms, you could still host them in the same resource group on Azure, or even give them their own resource groups in the same subscription, or even give them their own subscription. So the more you can separate it, the better. And even giving them the option to say, you can run this in your own cloud, and the mobile app and the thick client will still connect to it, is a really good option for those ultra secure environments.
Yeah, fantastic, and especially that. I hadn't really thought of it. The marketing point. That's a really important point. Sometimes as technologists we forget about. That's a super important one.
Yeah. Yeah, I have been in those kind of discussions with kind of board members and execs that have wanted security things in place because of what they say they do, even though doing things a different way achieves the same result. And sometimes that's just what you've got to do, especially with security being such a hot topic at the moment.
So you just did an application, Matt, that has the highest levels of security with the IRAP assessment and stuff. Was there any special multi-tenancy considerations for that app?
Absolutely.
That you wouldn't do on a normal app?
Again, it depends. So this particular app is always going to be a single tenant app. It's always going to be an app that gets deployed. Each client or customer that uses this application is going to have their own instance of it running, that is running potentially in their own cloud. It can be hosted, but either way, it's going to be owned and operated by them. There are other applications where you can have all of your customers' data in the one instance and separate those tenants out through other means. This certainly isn't one of them, and you would never do that with it. And even though, as I said, logically you can have your security mechanisms in place that keep customer A away from customer B's data, well, if customer A don't have access to the database where customer B's data is, you don't even have to worry about that logical separation. And that's certainly some, and this is the thing, is we talk about how confident we are that it's logically separated and there's no way that they can get across. But for your customer to have the confidence that they need as a non-tech, as a customer, as a consumer of your product, for them to have that confidence is a really, really strong selling point and a really good, not just a marketing point, but it's a good feeling for them, and it's all about minimizing risk.
One other question just about reporting. Like a lot of customers now are saying, look, I want the ability for ad hoc reporting. So the obvious solution is Power BI.
Yeah.
That can have some considerations on that multi-tenancy choice as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I have been in a real-world situation where we've had that. In a previous organisation I was working for, we had all kinds of reports, executive reports, operational reports across the whole organisation. We had all these dashboards, and they connected into different applications that we had. And one of those applications was moving to the cloud, or to being hosted by the vendor. And we had our reporting engine, which wasn't Power BI, I think it was SQL Reporting Services, hooking directly into that database, doing is only queries, read-only queries, can't change any data, but just reading data from that database to create these reports. And when we moved to the cloud, we couldn't do that. And even though they could say, yeah, you can there's ways of securing it so that you only have access to your same data. In fact, theoretically, it's possible for them to give you access to the database with exactly the same permissions that you have as a user using the web app, but they just say no, they don't allow direct connections to their database. And that's, from a security perspective as well, they don't want to expose that database. That database is only accessible via their app service or via their app. So yes, that's a consideration. If you want to do reporting with something like Power BI, and for that reason you need to access to the database, you can't do it. You'd be very lucky to find a multi-tenant application host that would say, yeah, we give you read access to the database. Not to say they don't exist, they do, some of them do. Some of them are progressive thinking and they think, yep, we can secure this, and they give you read access, but most absolutely won't. And most, out of fear that their customers would say, wait, if I have read access to the database, that means that guy does as well, and that's terrible. So in that kind of multi-tenancy environment, well, let me put it another way. If you have those kind of reporting requirements, you're going to want to either look at a single tenant standalone instance of your application for yourself, or you're going to need to work with that vendor or hosting provider to ship data off to you in a read-only fashion that your reporting engine can read.
So would you go for a sort of an analytics API or a separate reporting API that is custom built for exactly what you're trying to query, and then your Power BI can connect to that sort of as a middleman rather than connecting directly to the databases.
So in the past, that's how it would have been done. You would have been left with the reporting capabilities of your application. So the reporting would be built into your application, and you'd be left with the reporting capabilities that your application has. Some of these applications have very customizable reporting capabilities, and you can get a lot out of them. I have always found that there's that one report that you can't do. And you have to either query the database or query the API to get data out. So, the way things are going, not just now, but probably for the past 5-10 years, is that because there's such powerful reporting tools available like Power BI, most of these applications are still giving you basic reporting capabilities, but not really putting the time into creating those highly customizable reports, because they just give you the data via an API. And usually that's what they do, is it's an API rather than read access to the database. So you are still constrained by what data the API exposes. A really cool way of dealing with that is to have a GraphQL API. GraphQL is very flexible, and in that case, you don't, you're using REST, for example, where you would have to expose a view model, or you'd have to expose a data transfer object that is shaped to how you've configured it as a developer. With GraphQL, you expose a schema, and then the people consuming it, in this case the people connecting to it with Power BI or your reporting service, they can query the schema, and whatever data is exposed by the schema, they can pull in whatever shape they want. So yes, at the reporting side, if you do need to connect to the database, you're going to probably need to look at single tenant, but also you probably don't need to connect to the database, because there's other ways of getting at that data.
Cool. So I've got one more question with that actually. If you are going via an API, you could anonymize the data. You can actually have another sort of layer of protection there to make sure you're not pushing out any sort of personally identifiable information from the database. Have you built anything of that sort recently at all? Sort of come across any issues with that? Or did it work?
You asked me 3 questions there. Have I built anything like that? Have I come across something like that? And any issues? Not necessarily in that order. I'll answer them all. I haven't personally built something like that. Have I come across issues? Yes, which I'll explain in a moment. And for those reasons, no, I wouldn't build something like that. And I'll give you an example. Have you heard of CAT, C-A-T? You may not have heard of this. It stands for, I think, Clinical Auditing Tool. And what it is it's a format that the Australian government mandated that all primary healthcare providers across all of Australia need to report to their local health service using CAT. This clinical auditing tool, I think it's called. My memory doesn't. It may not be correct on that one. But what it does is it doesn't anonymize the data, but it de-identifies it. Okay, and then it sends it up to the local health district, and local health send it up to the state health board, who then send it up to the federal health, who use it for population health planning and things like COVID response and that kind of stuff. Although we are of course seeing that happen at a state level and not a federal level at the moment, but that's what they do with that data. And also, by the way, it's opt out. So when you go and sign up at your GP, you're opted into it. You have to opt out. It's not an opt-in service, it's an opt-out service.
Right.
So anyway, this data gets de-identified and it gets sent up the chain, and then gets put back together and used for population health. Well, it was a university in Melbourne, I can't remember which one, but they basically did some research on this, and they found that they were able to re-identify this data. And they found that even people in vulnerable areas or vulnerable patients like children, they were actually able to use this data and reassemble it. So for that reason,
that's scary. You don't want that happening.
No, you don't. So I wouldn't do that. No, for that reason.
Good advice. Thanks.
Well, that was a fabulous talk, Matt. I'm really happy that you put all that stuff together. I know that I think anyone that's had to deal with this problem is very understanding of what you've done, and the people that have not dealt with this problem will be dealing with this in the future. So that was
well, now
fantastic.
They don't have to.
Yeah, really good. All right, so I'll let you I'll let you close it out, Matty.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Thank you very much. Will, thank you for your questions. I really appreciated that and the feedback. And to you guys on the live stream, thank you so much. As I said earlier, I really enjoyed putting this together. It's been fantastic having you guys all here this evening. And good night. Thanks very much.
See ya. Bye.